Sterling Thorne stood on the rain-slicked curb. He was clutching a cardboard box and a shattered ego while I sat in his mahogany chair. I was signing the deed to his life. The elite of this city believed Elara Vance was a ghost, a harmless analyst who had forgotten her place. They laughed while they stripped her of her grandfather's legacy. They didn't know they were laughing at their own funeral. As Elara adjusted the gilded serpent brooch on her lapel, she wasn't seeking revenge. She was enforcing a contract. Sterling Thorne made one mistake. He bought the land. But Elara Vance owns the earth beneath it. 100 years of mineral rights. One lethal loophole. In the next hour, you will see how a single signature can turn a billionaire into a ghost. This is not about luck. This is a masterclass in systemic destruction. Pay attention, because by the end of this story, you will never look at a deed of sale the same way again. The air in the senator's office did not just feel expensive. It felt heavy. It was a density born from decades of secrets and the crushing weight of institutional power. The room smelled of mahogany oil and the faint, acidic scent of vintage ink. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city of Washington stretched out like a grid of light and shadow. But inside this room, only one man mattered. Senator Sterling Thorne sat behind a desk carved from a single piece of ancient oak. He was a man who moved with the slow, deliberate confidence of someone who had never been told no. His suit was a charcoal pinstripe that cost more than most people earned in a year. He leaned back in his leather chair. His eyes were fixed on a document that lay at the center of the desk. These were the seizure papers for the Blackwood district. To the public, it was a revitalization project. To Thorne, it was a $900 million land grab. He picked up a gold fountain pen. He held it like a scepter. He loved this part of the job. The moment where he turned a community's history into a corporate asset with a single stroke. He didn't see the families who had lived there for generations. He didn't see the legacy of the people who had built the city's foundations. He only saw the golf course and the luxury condos that would soon bear his name. Thorne looked up as the door opened. A server entered the room. She was moving with a quiet, invisible grace that the powerful often mistake for servitude. She was a woman of deep bronze skin. Her face was a master class in stillness. Her high cheekbones caught the dim light of the office. Her almond-shaped eyes were lowered. She looked like a shadow in a room full of light. This was Elara Vance. Thorne did not truly see her. To him, she was just another part of the furniture. He didn't notice the precise, waist-length silk-pressed ponytail wrapped in gold wire that hung down her back. He didn't notice the way her hands remained perfectly steady as she placed a silver tray on the edge of the oak desk. Elara poured the coffee. The sound of the liquid hitting the porcelain cup was the only noise in the room. Beside the cup, she placed a small cream pitcher. As she moved, the light from the desk lamp hit her left lapel. It illuminated the Gilded Serpent Brooch. The emerald eyes of the two 4K gold snakes seemed to glow with a cold, predatory intelligence. Elara felt the weight of the brooch against her heart. It was a reminder of who she was. A reminder that while she was serving his coffee, she was actually presiding over his downfall. Thorne reached for the coffee without looking. He took a sip. He savored the heat. Then he looked back at the papers. He smiled. It was a thin, jagged smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "I suppose the residents of Blackwood will find somewhere else to exist," Thorne muttered. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp. He wasn't talking to Elara. He was talking to the ghost of his own ambition. Progress requires a certain level of sacrifice. Elara stood by the window. She adjusted the gold wire on her ponytail. Her mind was a high-speed processor. She was calculating the exact moment the ink would dry. She had spent 5 years at the International Monetary Fund analyzing sovereign risks. She knew that the most dangerous risk wasn't a market crash. It was a woman who knew the law better than the men who wrote it. The seizure papers Thorne was about to sign were based on the 1924 city charter. Thorne believed he was using eminent domain to take the land for public use. He had manipulated the zoning boards. He had bribed the city planners. He thought the game was over, but Elara knew the secret of the 1924 charter. She had spent 6 months in the sub-basements of the National Archives. She had found the original deed. The land was not owned by the city. It was held in a reversionary trust, a ghost trust that had been dormant for a century. The trust stipulated that if the land was ever used for anything other than a public park, the title would immediately revert to the heirs of the original grantor and Elara. Vance was the only living heir. Thorne lowered the pen to the paper. The gold tip hovered over the signature line. Elara watched his reflection in the dark glass of the window. Her pulse was a slow, rhythmic drum. She felt the cold metal of the Gilded Serpent Brooch through the fabric of her uniform. The senator signed his name. Sterling Thorne. The ink was a deep, permanent blue. He pressed down hard. He wanted the signature to be bold. He wanted it to be final. Done, Thorne whispered. He tossed the pen onto the desk. He picked up the papers and blew on the ink to dry it. He looked at the document with the pride of a conqueror. He believed he had just secured his dynasty. Elara stepped forward. She reached for the empty coffee cup. Her movement was fluid. Professional. Will there be anything else, Senator? Elara asked. Her voice was calm. It was a low, melodic tone that carried the hidden weight of a verdict. Thorne didn't look up. He was already reaching for his phone to call his developers. No, that will be all. You can go. Elara picked up the tray. She turned and walked toward the door. As she reached the threshold, she paused. She looked back over her shoulder. Thorne was laughing into his phone. He was telling someone that the deal was closed. He was telling them that the Blackwood district was officially theirs. Elara touched the Gilded Serpent Brooch one last time. She didn't feel anger. She felt the cold intellectual satisfaction of a trap that had just snapped shut. Thorne had just signed a document that admitted to a violation of the reversionary trust. By signing that paper, he had legally triggered the automatic transfer of all assets associated with the project back to the Vance estate. He hadn't just failed to seize the land. He had just handed Elara the legal standing to sue his entire development firm into bankruptcy. He had signed his own financial death warrant. And he had done it with a smirk. Elara stepped out into the hallway. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind her. The sound echoed through the marble corridor like a gavel hitting a bench. The silence of the hallway was a stark contrast to the noise of Thorne's celebration inside. She walked toward the elevators. Her reflection in the polished brass doors showed a woman who was no longer a server. She was the chief sovereign risk analyst again. She was the matriarch. The gold wire in her hair caught the light. The emerald eyes of the serpent brooch flashed in her pocket. Her phone vibrated. It was a message from her legal team. They were waiting at the courthouse. They were ready to file the injunction the moment she gave the word. Elara watched the floor. Numbers countdown. 10, 9, 8. With every floor, the distance between Thorne and his empire grew. He was still in his office, drinking his coffee, believing he was the king of the city. He didn't realize that the woman who served him had just dismantled his throne. Institutional justice is not a fast process. It is a slow, grinding machine. It requires patience. It requires a deep understanding of the loopholes that the arrogant believe are there. Protection. Elara stepped out of the elevator and into the cool night air. The rain had started to fall. It washed the dust from the streets. It made the pavement shine like black glass. She pulled a dark trench coat over her uniform. She covered the brooch. She covered the gold wire. She looked up at the top floor of the Thorne building. The lights were still on. Sleep well, Senator. She whispered into the wind. Tomorrow morning, you will wake up to a world where you own nothing. The first step was complete. The master's arrogance had provided the signature. Now, the systemic destruction of Sterling Thorne could, truly begin. The silence in Elara's private study was different from the silence in the senator's office. In Thorne's world, silence was a vacuum. It was the absence of sound before a storm of ego, a tear. In this room lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves of vellum-bound ledgers, silence was a tool. It was the quiet hum of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The temperature in the study was kept at a precise 68 degrees. It was the ideal climate for preserving the ghosts of the past. The air smelled of old paper, dry cedar, and the faint metallic temps of the gold wire wrapped around Elara's ponytail. She sat at her desk. It was a minimalist slab of black obsidian that seemed to swallow the light. On the desk lay a digitized scan of the 1924 city charter. To a layman, this document was a relic of a forgotten bureaucracy. To Sterling Thorne, it was a footnote he had paid a team of junior associates to ignore. But Elara Vance did not ignore footnotes. She lived in them. She reached up and touched the Gilded Serpent Brooch on her lapel. The 24,000 gold felt cold against her fingertip. The emerald eyes of the snake glittered under the soft LED lamp. They seemed to mock the arrogance of the men who thought they could own the earth without understanding the law. Elara's mind drifted back to her days at the International Monetary Fund. She had spent years analyzing sovereign risk. She had seen nations collapse because of a single misplaced comma in a debt restructuring agreement. She knew that power was not about who had the most money today. It was about who controlled the liabilities of tomorrow. She looked at the screen. Paragraph 14. Subsection C, the Reversionary Clause. The wording was precise. It was lethal. It stated that the parcel of land known as the Blackwood District was granted to the city under a conditional fee. Simple. There was a specific mandate. The land must serve the public good as a dedicated green space. If at any point the municipal authorities attempted to convert the land for private commercial gain, the title would not just be contested. It would automatically revert. The ownership would snap back to the grantor's estate. It would happen instantly, without the need for a court order. It was a legal tripwire set a century ago, a ghost waiting in the machinery of the cities. Foundation Sterling Thorne had just committed $900 million of investor capital to a project built on a title that was about to vanish. Elara leaned back in her chair. Her deep bronze skin looked radiant against the black obsidian desk. Her high cheekbones were sharp, defined. She was the picture of quiet luxury. But her mind was a battlefield. She could have stopped him. She could have walked into that office and presented the charter. She could have demanded a seat at the table in exchange for her silence. That is what a common grifter would do. But Elara was not a grifter. She was an architect of institutional justice. If she spoke now, Thorne would simply pivot. He would use his political influence to lobby for a legislative override. He would find a way to bury the clause before the ink was dry on the development contracts. No, to destroy a man like Sterling Thorne, you must let him build his own gallows. She stayed silent. She watched the news feed on her second monitor. There was Thorne. He was standing on a podium. He was wearing a hard hat that looked too clean. He was holding a silver shovel. He was telling the cameras that the Blackwood project would bring thousands of jobs and luxury living to a forgotten corner of the city. The crowd cheered. The investors smiled. The stock price for Thorne's development firm climbed 4% in 30 minutes. Elara felt a cold shiver of satisfaction. Every dollar he raised, every beam of steel he ordered, every contract he signed, it was all a gift to her. He was currently acting as her unpaid project manager. He was using his reputation and his credit lines to improve a property that he no longer legally owned. He was building a $900 million monument to his own stupidity. Elara picked up a fountain pen. She didn't write anything. She just felt the weight of it. She thought about the fiduciary duty Thorne owed to his shareholders. He was in breach of it. He was operating under a clouded title. He was committing securities fraud. Even if he didn't know it yet, in the world of strategic power, ignorance is not a defense. It is a liability. Elara closed her eyes for a moment. She could see the entire chessboard. The investors were the pawns. The city council members were the bishops. Thorne was the king. But she was the one who owned the board. She thought about the residents of Blackwood. The families Thorne had dismissed as obstacles. They were the true beneficiaries of the reversionary trust. Her grandfather had seen the greed. Men like Thorne coming 100 years ago. He had built this trap to ensure that the land would always belong to the people, or to someone who respected the people. The Gilded Serpent Brooch caught the light again. It was a symbol of wisdom and rebirth, but also of a strike that comes from the tall grass. Elara opened her eyes. They were focused, unblinking. She checked the time. It was nearly midnight. Thorne was likely celebrating with a glass of expensive scotch. He was probably looking at the city and feeling like he had conquered it. Let him have his night. Let him feel the warmth of the sun before the eclipse. Elara stood up. Her silk-pressed ponytail swayed with perfect precision. The gold wire shimmered. She walked to the window of her study. The city lights were a blur of gold and white. She wasn't just a woman seeking revenge. She was a sovereign entity. She was the correction the market had been waiting for. She knew exactly what would happen next. Thorne would break ground. He would pour the foundations. He would spend the first $200 million of the construction loan. And then, when he was at his most vulnerable, when he was legally and financially committed beyond the point of no return, that is when the ghost would peer. The 1924 city charter was currently sitting in a digital vault. Elara had the only copy with the original surveyor's seal. She would keep it there. She would watch the steel rise. She would watch the marketing brochures go out. She would stay silent while he sold penthouses that didn't belong to him. The silence was heavy. It was the silence of a vault. Sterling Thorne thought he had one. He thought he had outsmarted the history of the city. He thought Elara Vance was a nobody, a servant who poured his coffee and faded into the background. He didn't realize that the servant was the landlord. Elara turned away from the window. She sat back down at the obsidian desk. She opened a new file. It wasn't a lawsuit. It wasn't a press release. It was a list of Thorne's primary creditors, one by one. She began to map out their vulnerabilities. If she was going to take the land, she was going to take the bank that funded the land. Institutional justice required a total erasure of the enemy. She felt the pulse in her fingertips. It was steady. Her hands were cold. Her mind was fire. This was the art of the wait. The $900 million ghost was already in the room with him. He just couldn't see it yet. Elara Vance reached out and dimmed the lamp. The room plunged into darkness. Only the emerald eyes of the serpent brooch remained visible for a heartbeat. Before they too disappeared into the night, the trap was set. The silence was absolute. The air in the penthouse was crisp, almost sterile. It was 4 o'clock in the morning, the hour of the architect. Elara Vance sat by the window. Her reflection was a ghost against the glass. Deep bronze skin, high cheekbones, eyes that saw through the darkness of the city below. She was not looking at the view. She was looking at a map of the valley, a map that Sterling Thorne had never seen. It was an infrared survey of the subterranean water tables. The hidden arteries of the land. A city is a living thing. It breathes, heats, but most importantly, it drinks. Sterling Thorne was building a body of glass and steel. He called it an empire. He called it progress. But an empire without water is just a beautiful tomb. Elara leaned forward. The movement was fluid, precise. The light from her tablet caught the gold wire wrapped around her. Waist-length silk-pressed ponytail. It shimmered like a coiled spring, ready to release. She reached up and touched the gilded serpent brooch on her left lapel. The 24,000 gold was cold. The emerald eyes of the snake flashed in the dim light. They were looking at the valley. She remembered her time at the IMF, analyzing the sovereign risks of desert nations. She had seen kingdoms fall not because of a lack of gold, but because of a lack of flow. In the world of strategic power, you do not attack the fortress. You poison the well. Or, in this case, you buy it? Sterling Thorne believed he owned the Blackwood district. He had the surface rights. He had the air rights for his towering penthouses. He had the ego of a king. But he had forgotten to look at the historical easements. He had forgotten about the 1882 Valley Aqueduct Agreement. It was a private deed, severed from the land over a century ago. It granted the holder absolute usufructuary rights to the aquifer beneath the valley. It was a legal anomaly, a ghost in the machinery of property law. Thorne's project required 6 million gallons of water every day. For the fountains, for the cooling systems of the data centers, for the lush green fairways of his private golf course. He assumed the city would provide it. He assumed his political connections made the supply guaranteed. He was wrong. Elara tapped a key on her laptop. The screen showed the confirmation of a wire transfer. $40 million. Moving through a series of shell companies based in the Cayman Islands. It ended in the account of a dormant agricultural trust. The entity was called Styx Holdings. It was a name Thorne would not recognize, a name that sounded like corporate filler. But Styx Holdings now held the deed to the water. The blood of Thorne's new empire now belonged to Elara Vance. She felt a slow heat rise in her chest. It was not anger. It was the clinical satisfaction of a successful surgery. She was reaching into the chest of Thorne's ambition and placing her. Hand on the heart. Sterling Thorne believed that money was the ultimate power. He was a third-generation senator. He thought the law was a tool he could bend. But Elara knew that the law was a series of locks. And she was the one who had spent years collecting the keys. She thought about the moment Thorne would realize the tap was dry. He would have the steel. He would have the glass. He would have the debt. But he would have no way to cool his buildings. No way to maintain his status. His revitalization would become a parched wasteland of concrete and dust. Institutional justice is often silent. It does not need a megaphone. It only needs a signature on a forgotten piece of parchment. Elara stood up. She walked to the center of the room. The scent of expensive materials filled the air. Italian leather, polished obsidian, and the faint, metallic smell of the gold wire in her hair. She felt the weight of the Gilded Serpent Brooch. It was a heavy, grounding presence. She looked at her reflection in a floor-to-ceiling mirror. She saw the former risk analyst. She saw the matriarch. She saw a woman who understood that true power is invisible. It is the debt that cannot be seen. It is the resource that is taken for granted until it is gone. Thorne's arrogance was his blind spot. He viewed the world as a stage for his performance. He didn't realize the stage was built over a void. Elara's mind began to calculate the next phase. Fiduciary duty. Thorne had taken on massive loans from international banks. These loans were contingent on the project meeting specific occupancy and operational deadlines. If the project had no water, it could not get an occupancy permit. If there was no permit, the loans would go into technical default. The banks would not care about Thorne's political status. They would only care about the collateral. And Thorne had put up his family estate as a personal guarantee. Elara walked back to the desk. She looked at the signature Sterling Thorne had placed on the seizure papers. It was a bold, aggressive scrawl. The signature of a man who thought he was invincible. She picked up her phone. She sent a single, encrypted message to her lead counsel. The tap is ours. Do not move yet. Let him build. She wanted him to spend more. She wanted the debt to grow. The heavier the weight, the faster the fall. She would wait until the first tower reached 30 floors. She would wait until the investors were fully committed. That is when the bill would arrive. An invisible debt for a resource he thought was free. Elara felt the pulse in her throat. It was steady, rhythmic. Her hands were perfectly still. She reached up and adjusted the serpent brooch. The emerald eyes seemed to wink at her. She thought about the residents of the valley. The people Thorne had pushed aside. They would soon see the kingmaker pleading for a drop of water. They would see the institution he built crumble from the inside out. This was not just about land. This was about the fundamental rights of the people, wrapped in the cold, calculating language of corporate law. The clock on the wall ticked. Each second was $1 added to Thorne's liability. Each minute was a step closer to the threshold of ruin. Elara sat back down. She closed her eyes. She could hear the sound of the water moving through the pipes miles away. It was a low, constant hum. The sound of her ownership. Sterling Thorne was sleeping, dreaming of his legacy, dreaming of the name Thorne, carved into the skyline. He didn't know that the name was already written in water. Elara Vance opened her eyes. They were cold. They were focused. The deep bronze of her skin glowed in the light of the rising sun. The gold wire in her hair caught the first rays. A crown of strategic power. The invisible debt was now a reality. The blood of the empire was in her hands. She reached out and closed the map of the valley. The screen went black. The hunt was moving into the next stage, the boardroom, where Thorne's own allies would become his executioners. The boardroom of Thorne International was a cathedral of glass and ego. It sat on the 40th floor, high above the noise of the common man. The air was chilled to exactly 64 degrees. It was a temperature that favored expensive wool suits and cold hearts. The scent of the room was a blend of ozone from the air purifiers and the faint, peppery smell of antique mahogany. At the head of the table sat Sterling Thorne. He looked like a man who had already won the war. He was leaning back. His fingers were laced behind his head. He was watching the 7 men and 3 women who controlled the largest private equity funds in the country. These were his investors, the people who provided the fuel for his ambition. Today, they were here to celebrate. The Blackwood project was fully funded. The construction cranes were already visible from the window. The skyline of the city was about to change, and Sterling Thorne was the man holding the pen. Thorne smiled. It was a predatory expression. Gentlemen and ladies, we are not just building apartments. We are building a legacy. In 24 months, this city will look at this tower and see the face of the new aristocracy. The investors nodded. They were men of paper and profit. They didn't care about legacy. They cared about the internal rate of return. They cared about the exit strategy. But Thorne was a kingmaker, and they were happy to follow a king into the vault. In her private sanctuary miles away, Elara Vance sat in total stillness. Her deep bronze skin was illuminated by the soft blue glow of 12 monitors. She was watching the boardroom through a hidden feed. She saw the smiles. She saw the champagne being poured into crystal flutes. She reached up and touched the gilded serpent brooch on her lapel. The 24,000 gold felt like a frozen sun under her fingers. She felt the sharp point of the snake's tail. It was a grounding sensation. Elara was not smiling. She was counting. She was counting the seconds until the blackout. Not a blackout of electricity, but a blackout of trust. In the world of global banking, information is the only true currency. If you control the narrative, you control the asset. But if the narrative is exposed as a lie, the asset becomes a liability. Elara moved her hand to the obsidian desk. Her silk-pressed ponytail was perfectly straight. The gold wire wrapped around it caught the light. She looked like a queen presiding over a silent execution. She pressed a single key. In the boardroom, 10 tablets chirped simultaneously. The sound was sharp. It cut through Thorne's speech like a blade. The investors reached for their devices. They expected a routine update, perhaps a notification of the initial stock surge. Instead, they found a file. The file was titled Project Ghost. It was not a marketing brochure. It was a forensic autopsy of the Blackwood district title. The room went silent. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the Patek Philippe clock on the wall. Each tick sounded like a hammer hitting a nail. Thorne noticed the shift in the atmosphere immediately. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. He sat forward, his brow furrowed. What is it? The lead investor, a man named Marcus Vane, was a veteran of 3 market crashes. His face turned the color of ash. He didn't look at Thorne. He looked at the screen. Sterling, what is the Reversionary Trust of 1924? Thorne paused. His heart skipped a single, irregular beat. He had heard the term before in a briefing. His lawyers had told him it was a clerical error, a ghost in the archives. I told you, Marcus. It is an old zoning formality. My team has already cleared it. Vane turned the tablet around. He pushed it across the mahogany table. It slid like a puck on ice. This isn't a formality, Sterling. This is a total cloud on the title. According to this forensic audit, the moment you broke ground on the foundation last week, you triggered a breach of the trust. Thorne reached for the tablet. His hands were steady, but his eyes were frantic. He scrolled through the document. It was all there. The original deed, the severed mineral rights Elara had bought, the private water easements, and the most lethal part of all, the personal indemnity clause. Elara had designed the file to highlight the one thing these investors feared more than losing money: personal liability, because Thorne had used a specific type of securitized bond to fund the project. The investors had signed off on a series of bad boy guarantees. These were legal triggers that stripped away the protection of their corporations if the project was found to be built on fraudulent information, if the title was clouded. They were not just losing the investment, they were personally responsible for the billions in construction debt, their houses, their yachts, their children's trust funds. It was all on the line. Professional ruin was not a possibility. It was a mathematical certainty. Elara Vance watched Thorne's face through the camera. She saw the moment the blood drained from his cheeks. She saw the way his high-velocity confidence evaporated into a cold, damp sweat. She felt a pulse of electricity in her own veins. This was the moment of the checkmate in the boardroom. The panic was silent, but it was absolute. Marcus Vane stood up. He didn't look like a billionaire anymore. He looked like a man who had just seen his own obituary. "We are pulling the capital, Sterling, all of it. Effective immediately." Thorne stood up. He slammed his hands on the desk. "You can't. The contracts are signed. The steel is already in the ground." Vane looked at him with a cold, dead stare. "The contracts were signed based on a clean title. You lied to us, Sterling. You committed fiduciary negligence. My lawyers will have the injunction filed before you leave this building. One by one." The other investors stood up. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. The silence was the sound of an empire collapsing. They walked toward the door. Thorne tried to stop them. He grabbed Vane's arm, but Vane brushed him off like he was a beggar on the street. "Do not call me Sterling. My next communication will be a lawsuit." The heavy oak door closed with a soft, final thud. Thorne was alone. The boardroom that had felt like a cathedral minutes ago now felt like a tomb. The champagne was still sitting in the glasses. The bubbles were fading. In her sanctuary, Elara Vance leaned back in her white leather chair. She adjusted the gilded serpent brooch. The emerald eyes seemed to sparkle with a secret knowledge. She had not just taken his money. She had taken his allies. She had turned the people who built him into the people who would bury him. Institutional justice is a cold mistress. She does not move with passion. She moves with the inevitability of a glacier. Elara looked at the screen. Thorne was standing by the window. He was looking at the cranes. He was looking at the project that was supposed to be his legacy. He didn't know that the cranes would stop moving by noon. He didn't know that the workers would be sent home. He didn't know that his bank accounts were already being frozen by the SEC based on the anonymous tip Elara had sent. He was a king without a kingdom, a senator without a vote. Elara Vance picked up a glass of chilled water. She took a slow, deliberate sip. She felt the cool liquid move down her throat. The blackout was complete, but the story was far from over. Thorne still had one move left. He still had the family estate. He still had the political connections. He would try to fight. He would try to crawl back from the edge. Elara placed the glass on the obsidian desk. She looked at the gold wire in her hair. It was a reminder of her grandfather. A reminder of why she was doing this. The elite think they are above the law. They think they can rewrite the history of the land to suit their greed. But they forgot that the land has a memory. And the archives have a guardian. Sterling Thorne had signed the seizure papers with a smirk. Now he would sign the bankruptcy papers with a tear. Elara Vance closed the connection to the boardroom. The monitors went dark. The only light left in the room was the glow from the Gilded Serpent. The next move was hers, and it would be a sovereign one. The corridors of the federal courthouse were silent, but it was a heavy silence. It felt like the air before a lightning strike. The temperature was maintained at a sharp, clinical degree. It smelled of floor wax in the cold. Metallic scent of old radiator steam. Sterling Thorne walked through the hall with the stride of a man who owned the building. He didn't care about the investor flight. Not yet. He believed in the power of the phone call. He had spent 30 years placing judges on the bench. He had spent 40 years buying the loyalty of the city's legal elite. To him, the law was a programmable code, and he was the lead developer. He entered the private chamber of Judge Miller, a man whose career Thorne had built from the ground up. Thorne didn't knock. He simply walked in and sat down. "Fix the title," Thorne said. His voice was a low, grated rasp. "I don't care about the reversionary trust. I don't care about the 1924 charter. Find a procedural error. Declare the document a forgery. Squash the injunction by morning." Judge Miller didn't look up. He was staring at a folder on his desk. His hands were trembling. "I can't." Sterling Thorne leaned forward. His eyes narrowed into slits. "What do you mean you can't? I made you. I can unmake you before lunch." Miller finally looked up. His face was the color of chalk. "You don't understand. The case hasn't been filed in a civil court. It wasn't filed in the municipal system. Your political influence stops at the high-water mark." Thorne's brow furrowed. "The high-water mark? What are you talking about?" Miller pushed a document across the desk. It wasn't a standard lawsuit. It was a writ of admiralty and her private sanctuary. Elara Vance sat perfectly still. She was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that matched the stormy sky outside. Her deep bronze skin was flawless, radiant. She reached up and touched the gold wire wrapped around her silk-pressed ponytail. It felt cold, secure. She looked at the gilded serpent brooch on her lapel. The emerald eyes of the snake seemed to burn with a fierce green light. She was thinking about the IMF. She was thinking about the time she spent studying the maritime borders of West Africa. She knew a secret that the landlocked elite of Washington had forgotten. When you can't win on the land, you move the battle to the sea. Elara had discovered a geological anomaly in the Blackwood district. In 1882, the entire valley was a tidal salt marsh. It was a littoral zone, a place where the river met the earth. The land Thorne was building on wasn't land at all. It was reclaimed silt, built over a navigable waterway. According to the ancient statutes of maritime law, any land created by the reclamation of a navigable waterway remains under the jurisdiction of admiralty courts. This was the sovereign move. Admiralty law is not civil law. It is a separate, rigid, and ancient system. It operates on the logic of the high seas. It is a world of warrants, arrests of property, and sovereign deeds that predate the Constitution itself. By filing her claim in an admiralty court, Elara had effectively moved the battlefield to a neutral territory. Sterling Thorne's judges had no power here. His political connections were useless. In the eyes of the Admiralty, he wasn't a senator. He was just a claimant on a vessel that was taking on water. Leaned back in her obsidian chair. She felt a slow, calculated heat in her chest. She had spent 6 months mapping the original 1882 tide lines. She had found the original surveyor's logs. The logs proved that the foundation of Thorne's tower sat directly on top of what was once a public wharf. Under the public trust doctrine of the sea, navigable waters and the lands beneath them are held in trust for the people. They cannot be sold. They cannot be seized for private golf courses. Sterling Thorne had built a billion-dollar empire on a legal phantom. Elara picked up a vintage fountain pen. She felt the weight of it. She thought about Thorne's face when he realized his lawyers were powerless. In an admiralty court, the burden of proof is reversed. The property itself is arrested. The court had already issued the warrant at that very moment. Federal marshals were arriving at the construction site. They weren't there to talk. They were there to chain the cranes. They were placing a physical notice of arrest on the steel. Beams Thorne's tower was now legally a seized vessel back in the judge's chamber. Thorne grabbed the writ of admiralty. He ripped it in half. This is a joke. A salt marsh? That was 100 years ago. This is my land. Miller shook his head slowly. It doesn't matter how long ago it was. Sterling, maritime jurisdiction never expires. The moment she proved the title history, this court lost all authority. You are now under the jurisdiction of the Federal Maritime Commission. Thorne felt a cold, clammy sweat break out on his neck. The commission? He didn't know anyone on the commission. He had spent his life focused on the Senate. On the local boards, he had ignored the ancient laws of the water because he thought they were for fishermen and shippers. He didn't realize they were for predators. Elara Vance walked to the window of her study. She looked out at the rain. The water was hitting the glass in long, rhythmic streaks. It reminded her of the power of the flow. You can build all the walls you want, but the water always finds the crack. She touched the Gilded Serpent Brooch. The 24,000 gold was a symbol of her lineage. Her grandfather had been a sailor before he was a landowner. He had taught her that the sea is the only thing that cannot be bought. She saw the flashing lights of the marshal's cars in the distance. The construction site was going dark. The workers were leaving. The project was frozen in time. Sterling Thorne was now facing more than just a title dispute. He was facing an international maritime lien. Every dollar he had spent was now collateral for the damages done to the public waterway. Elara's phone buzzed on the desk. A message from Marcus Vane, the lead investor. Vane wrote, "We see the arrest warrant. Thorne is a dead man walking. What is your price for the debt?" Elara didn't reply. Not yet. She wanted the debt to mature. She wanted Thorne to feel the isolation of the open sea. When you are adrift, you will give anything for a piece of solid ground. She was going to offer him that ground, but only after he had lost everything else. Institutional justice is a long game. It requires the patience of a deep-sea diver. You descend slowly. You manage the pressure. And you never blink until you see the target. Elara Vance was now the commander of the waters. She turned away from the window. The room was dark, save for the glow of the monitors. She sat down and began to prepare the next filing, the legacy secret. Thorne thought the salt marsh was his only problem. He didn't know that the water had revealed something else. Something buried in the mud of the 1880s. A secret that would prove his family's entire fortune was built on a crime that the sea never forgot. The sovereign move was just the beginning of the end. Sterling Thorne was no longer the kingmaker. He was just a man on a sinking ship. And Elara Vance was the storm. She adjusted her silk press ponytail. The gold wire shimmered. She felt the pulse in her fingertips. Steady, cold, absolute. The law of the land had failed. The law of the sea had arrived. The interior of the black Cadillac Escalade was a vacuum of cold, leather, and desperate silence. Outside, the rain of the capital city turned the world into a blur of gray and neon. Sterling Thorne sat in the back. His fingers were trembling as he gripped his encrypted smartphone. He didn't look like a kingmaker anymore. He looked like a man trying to hold back the tide with a broken shovel. The Admiralty arrest of his construction site was not just a legal hurdle. It was a public execution. The images of federal marshals chaining his cranes were already trending on every financial news network in the world. His phone was vibrating with a relentless, violent rhythm. Investors, lawyers, journalists. They were all smelling blood in the water. Thorne ignored them all. He had one card left to play. The ultimate card. He swiped through his contacts until he found the one labeled the Shepherd. This was Governor Robert Harrison, a man Thorne had plucked from a quiet law firm 20 years ago. Thorne had funded his first run for the State House. He had cleared the scandals from his path to the governor's mansion. In the hierarchy of power, Harrison was a vassal, and Thorne was the lord. He pressed the call button. He held the phone to his ear. He waited for the familiar, subservient voice. The call went to voicemail. Thorne's jaw tightened. He felt a sharp, stabbing pain in his chest. He tried again, voicemail, He looked out the window. The car was passing the Lincoln Memorial. The stone giant looked down at him with a cold, impartial stare. Thorne felt a surge of white-hot rage. He dialed the private line of the governor's chief of staff, a man who owed his very soul to Thorne's influence. The phone rang 4 times. Then a voice answered. It wasn't the chief of staff, it was a junior secretary. Her voice was flat. Professional. Governor Harrison's office. How may I direct your call? This is Senator Thorne. Put the governor on. Now. There was a pause. A long, excruciating pause. Thorne could hear the sound of papers shuffling in the background. I am sorry, Senator. The governor is in a closed-door session. Regarding the new environmental compliance bill. He is unavailable for the remainder of the day. Thorne's grip on the phone was so tight his knuckles turned white. Listen to me carefully. Tell him Sterling Thorne is on the line. Tell him the Blackwood project is under a federal injunction and I need a state-level override of the maritime designation. Tell him if he doesn't pick up this phone, I will remind the public exactly who paid for his daughter's tuition. The secretary's voice didn't waver. I will relay the message. Senator, however, I should inform you that the governor has issued a standing order. All communications regarding the Blackwood district are to be routed through the Department of Compliance and Public Trust. The line went dead. Thorne stared at the screen. He felt a cold, clammy sweat soaking into his charcoal suit. This was impossible. Harrison didn't move without Thorne's permission. The political machinery of the state was built on Thorne's personal ledger. He opened his laptop. He bypassed the public search engines and logged into the private database of the State Election Commission. He needed to see the latest quarterly filings. He needed to see who Harrison was talking to. In her penthouse. Miles away from the chaos, Elara Vance sat in a chair of white silk. She was the definition of absolute, unshakable calm. Her deep bronze skin was glowing in the soft light of a single floor lamp. She reached up and touched the Gilded Serpent Brooch. The 24,000 gold felt like a living warmth against her chest. She adjusted the emerald eyes of the snake. They were fixed on the screen where she was tracking Thorne's digital footprint. She knew exactly what he was looking for. She had left the trail for him to find. Strategic power is not just about having more money than your enemy. It is about controlling the flow of that money. At the IMF, Elara had seen how small targeted donations could pivot the policy of entire continents. She understood that a governor's loyalty is not a permanent asset. It is a lease. And she had just outbid Thorne for the renewal. Thorne screen-loaded the donor list for the Harrison Victory Fund. He scrolled past the small donors, past the corporate PACs. He went straight to the top. The chairman's circle. There was a single name at the top of the list, Vance. Thorne stared at the name. It didn't register at first. He thought it was a shell company, an offshore entity. But then he saw the address listed for the contribution. It was the same address where Elara Vance had lived for 3 years while working at the IMF. The donation was $50 million. It was a staggering sum. A contribution so large it effectively made the governor an employee of the donor. It was a legal move. A masterpiece of campaign finance. Strategy. Thorne felt the air leave his lungs. Vance. He remembered the woman who had served his coffee. He remembered the way she had stood in the corner of his office, quiet, invisible. He remembered the high cheekbones, the almond eyes, the way the light had reflected off the gold wire in her hair. He had thought she was a servant. In reality, she was the person who owned the man he thought was his greatest ally. Thorne's phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. It read, "Silence is expensive." Sterling. He dropped the phone on the floor of the car. He felt a wave of nausea. He realized that every move he had made for the last 6 months had been monitored. Every phone call, Every bribe, every strategic decision. Elara Vance had been there. She hadn't just sued him. She had politically decapitated him by becoming the governor's largest donor. Elara had secured a right of first refusal on all state-level legislation. Harrison couldn't help Thorne even if he wanted to. To help Thorne would be to violate his fiduciary duty to his primary benefactor. Thorne looked out the window. The car was stuck in traffic. He felt trapped. He felt small. The skyline he had spent his life building now felt like a caged dot in the penthouse. Elara Vance stood up. Her silk-pressed ponytail swayed with a rhythmic, fluid motion. She walked to the window. She looked at the rain hitting the glass. It was a beautiful, chaotic pattern. She touched the gold wire at the base of her ponytail. She thought about her grandfather. He had been a man of the earth, a man who believed in the weight of a person's word. Thorne had broken that word. He had treated the land like a commodity and the people like an inconvenience. Now he was learning the price of arrogance. Thorne picked up his phone from the floor. He tried to dial Harrison one more time. The number was disconnected. The silence of the senator was not a choice. It was a condition. He had been cut off from the network of power that had sustained his family for 3 generations. He was a sovereign entity of one. Elara Vance turned away from the window. She walked back to her desk. She picked up a small, ornate bell. She rang it once. A moment later, a young man in a crisp uniform entered the room. "Yes, Miss Vance. The senator will be looking for a way to liquidate his personal assets by tomorrow morning," Elara said. Her voice was like velvet over steel. "Make sure our shell companies are the only ones making offers. I want his family estate. I want the vintage car collection. I want the art." She paused. She looked at the Gilded Serpent Brooch. "I want him to watch me move into his house." While he is still packing his bags, the assistant bowed. "It will be done." Elara sat back down. She closed her eyes. She felt the heavy weight of the secrets she carried. She felt the satisfaction of a job half done. Sterling Thorne thought the battle was over because he had lost the project. He didn't realize that the project was just the bait. The real goal was the total erasure of the Thorne name from the history of this city. Institutional justice is not about a single win. It is about the complete reconstruction of the system. Thorne's car finally began to move. He told the driver to take him home. He needed to think. He needed to find a loophole, but Elara Vance was already there. She was already in the code of his life. She was the invisible architect of his ruin. The silence of the senator. It's just the beginning of the end. The grandfather clock in the foyer of the Thorne estate did not tick. It hammered. Each rhythmic strike of the brass pendulum felt like a nail being driven into the coffin of a dynasty. Sterling Thorne stood in the center of the great hall. The room was a monument to 3 generations of stolen influence. The walls were lined with original oil paintings of men who looked exactly like him. Arrogant, untouchable, predatory, but the air in the house had changed. It no longer smelled of beeswax and expensive cigars. It smelled of damp earth and stagnant water. It smelled of the rot that begins in the foundation. Thorne held a thick, manila envelope in his hands. It was embossed with the seal of the Department of Environmental Compliance. It was not a request for information. It was a final notice of assessment. $480 million. The number felt like a physical weight, a crushing pressure on his lungs. The fine was for acute environmental negligence and systematic violation of the Clean Water Act. For 40 years, the Thorne family had operated a small, private chemical processing facility on the edge of their estate. They had buried the waste in the soil. They had let it seep into the local watershed. They had assumed that their political connections made the ground beneath their feet immune to the law. They were wrong. An anonymous audit had been triggered. A whistleblower had provided the exact GPS coordinates of the burial pits. The state had not sent a polite letter. They had sent a fleet of drilling rigs and a team of forensic geologists. They had found the poison, and now they were demanding the cure. Thorne walked to his mahogany desk. He picked up his phone. He tried to call his CFO. The call went straight to a busy signal. He tried to call his personal banker at Deutsche. The line was disconnected. He was a man trapped in a house of cards, and the wind was picking up Dot in her private study. Elara Vance sat in a pool of moonlight. She was the picture of surgical precision. Her deep bronze skin was luminous, a sharp contrast to the black obsidian of her desk. She reached up and touched the gilded serpent brooch on her left lapel. The 24,000 gold felt warm. The emerald eyes of the snake were the only color in the room. They seemed to glow with a quiet, ancient satisfaction. She adjusted the gold wire wrapped around her silk-pressed ponytail. She felt the tension of the wire. It was a physical manifestation of the trap she had built. Elara knew that Sterling Thorne's greatest weakness was his attachment to his legacy. He didn't just want power. He wanted the world to remember that the Thornes were the masters of the land. By targeting his family estate, she was not just attacking his bank account. She was attacking his identity. The environmental audit was a masterpiece of institutional revenge. Elara had spent years at the IMF studying the intersection of corporate liability and environmental law. She knew that the polluter pays principle was the ultimate weapon against the old gentry. It was a strict liability offense. There was no defense of ignorance. There was no political favor that could erase the chemical signature of the soil. She had triggered the audit through a local nonprofit she secretly funded, a group dedicated to watershed preservation. It was a clean move, a legal move. It was the Matriarch's will in action. Thorne had no liquidity left. His cash was tied up in the frozen Blackwood project. His credit lines had been severed by the Admiralty Court injunction. His investors had turned into his fiercest litigants. He had only one asset left. That was worth enough to cover the fine. The house. Elara leaned back in her chair. She could feel the pulse in her fingertips. It was slow, rhythmic. She thought about her grandfather. He had once worked on this very estate as a gardener. He had been fired without pay because Sterling Thorne's father didn't like the way he spoke. He had been told that men like him were disposable. "The land has a long memory," Elara whispered. Her voice was a low, melodic tone that carried the weight of a century. She watched the live feed of the Thorne estate on her monitor. She saw the lights flickering in the library. She saw Thorne pacing like a caged animal. He was looking at his paintings. He was looking at the marble floors. He was realizing that he was no longer the owner. He was merely a squatter in a house that the state was about to seize. The liquidation trap was closing under the Asset Forfeiture and Environmental Remediation Act. The state had the power to place a lien on all real property associated with a major violation. If the fine was not paid within 48 hours, the property would be put up for a distressed auction. Thorne didn't have 48 hours. He didn't even have 48 minutes. He sat down at his desk and opened a drawer. He pulled out a fountain pen, the same gold pen he had used to sign the seizure papers for the Blackwood district. His hand was shaking. He began to draft a letter to his legal team. Liquidate the estate. He wrote. His handwriting was jagged, desperate. Sell the paintings. Sell the furniture. Sell the land. Just stop the fines. He didn't realize that the market for toxic estates was non-existent. No one would buy a property with a $500 million environmental liability. No one. Except for a specific shell company based in the Cayman Islands. A company called Vance Sovereign Holdings, Elara. Vance picked up a small, silver bell. She rang it once. The sound was clear, pure. A moment later, her lead strategist entered the room. "He is ready," Elara said. She didn't look at the man. She kept her eyes on the screen. "Place the bid. $1 over the environmental lien. Not a penny more. But the estate is worth $80 million on its own." The strategist replied, "It is worth whatever the buyer is willing to pay for the liability," Elara countered. Her voice was cold, final, and "I am the only one willing to pay for his sins." The strategist bowed and left the room. Elara stood up. She walked to the window. The city of Washington was a grid of light, a machine that ran on the rules she had mastered. She felt the weight of the Gilded Serpent Brooch. It was a heavy, grounding presence. She thought about the symmetry of it all. Thorne had tried to take a district that belonged to her family. Now she was taking the ground his family was born on. She was erasing the Thorne name from the deed of the earth. This was the real cost of arrogance. It wasn't just the loss of money. It was the loss of the past. Thorne would spend the rest of his life in a rented apartment. He would walk past this house and see her name on the gate. He would see the Matriarch's flag flying from the roof. He would know that every time it rained, the water was washing away the last traces of his father's legacy. The grandfather clock in the Thorne estate struck the hour. 12 midnight. The deadline had passed. The lien was now a foreclosure. Sterling Thorne dropped his pen. He leaned back and stared at the ceiling. He felt a sudden, sharp coldness in his limbs. He realized that for the first time in his life, he was truly, entirely alone. The institution he had served had turned its back on him. The justice he had manipulated had found a way to find him. Elara Vance watched the screen as the notice of sale was posted to the public registry sold. She turned away from the window. She walked back to her desk and closed her laptop. The room went dark. Save for the emerald eyes of the serpent, the liquidation trap had been a success. The Thorne estate was gone. The senator was a ghost, but the final checkmate was still to come. The checkmate meeting where she would finally reveal her face to the man who thought she was a servant. She adjusted her silk-pressed ponytail. The gold wire shimmered in the dark. The silence was absolute. The air in the senator's office was stagnant. It felt like the inside of a tomb that had been sealed for centuries. The scent of mahogany and expensive leather was still there, but it was overshadowed by something sharper, something colder. It was the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of an empire in its final stages of liquidation. Sterling Thorne sat behind his oak desk. He looked smaller than he had 48 hours ago. His charcoal suit, once a symbol of his absolute authority, now seemed to hang loosely from his shoulders. His face was a map of exhaustion. Deep lines were etched around his mouth. His eyes were bloodshot, scanning a stack of frantic legal memos that no longer mattered. The grandfather clock in the corner was the only thing moving. Each tick was a hammer strike. Each second was a dollar being drained from his frozen accounts. Thorne was waiting for his lead counsel. He was waiting for a miracle. He was waiting for someone to tell him that the Admiralty Court had made a mistake, that the governor had finally answered his calls, that the environmental lien was just a clerical error. Instead, the heavy oak door opened. The sound of the latch clicking was like a gunshot in the silent room. Thorne didn't look up. "Is that you, Miller? Tell me we have the stay. Tell me the marshals are leaving the site. I am afraid the marshals are staying exactly where they are." Thorne froze. The voice was not Miller's. It was a low, melodic tone that carried the weight of a final verdict. It was a voice he had heard before, but never like this. He looked up. Elara Vance stood in the doorway. She did not look like the woman who had served him coffee. She did not look like a shadow in the corner of the room. She was the definition of absolute, sovereign power. She was wearing a tailored suit of charcoal silk that shimmered like liquid mercury. Her deep bronze skin was radiant. Her high cheekbones caught the dim light, making her face look like a sculpture of mahogany and light. Her almond-shaped eyes were fixed on him. They were calm. They were unblinking. Her waist-length silk-pressed ponytail was a river of dark ink down her back. The gold wire wrapped at its base gleamed. It looked like a crown that had been hidden in plain sight. On her left lapel, the Gilded Serpent Brooch sat like a silent guardian. The 24,000 gold body of the snake coiled around her heart. The emerald eyes flashed a cold, predatory green. Thorne stared at her. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at her lapel. He looked at the gold wire in her hair. The pieces of the puzzle were finally clicking together, but the picture they formed was a nightmare. "You?" Thorne whispered. His voice was a hollow rasp. It was you the whole time. Elara walked into the room. Her heels made no sound on the thick Persian rug. She moved with the quiet luxury of someone who didn't need to hurry because she already owned the time. She stopped in front of the desk. She didn't sit. She stood over him. You always did have a problem with visibility. Sterling, Elara said. You see the title, but you never see the person holding it. You see the office, but you never see the architecture of the power behind it. Thorne surged to his feet. He slammed his hands on the desk. You think you've won? You think a few environmental fines and a maritime loophole can destroy a Thorne? I will spend every penny I have to bury you. I will tie you up in litigation for the next 50 years. Elara didn't flinch. She didn't move. She watched him with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a dying cell. With what money? Sterling, your corporate assets are under a federal freeze. Your private equity partners have filed a multi-billion-dollar class action suit for fiduciary negligence. Your campaign funds have been seized for the environmental remediation of your family estate. She leaned forward, just enough to let the light hit the emerald eyes of the serpent brooch. You are not a senator anymore. You are a liability. Thorne's hands began to tremble. He looked at the legal memos on his desk. He looked at the silent phone. He felt the walls of the office closing in on him. He felt the weight of the secrets he had kept for 40 years pressing against his chest. Why? Thorne asked. Why go to all this trouble? If you wanted money, you could have asked for it. If you wanted a seat, I could have given it to you. Why destroy everything? Elara reached into her charcoal suit jacket. She pulled out a single, blue-bound document. She placed it on the desk, directly over the signature Sterling had placed on the seizure papers days ago. I didn't come here to sue you, Sterling. I have already done that. I didn't come here to talk about the project. That is over. She tapped the document with a manicured finger. I came here to show you this. Thorne looked down. His eyes scanned the header. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a lawsuit. It wasn't a notice of foreclosure. It was a grant deed. The property listed was a 100-acre estate in the Northern Hills. It was a house with white pillars and a long, winding driveway lined with oak trees. It was the house where Sterling Thorne had been born. It was the house where his father had taught him how to manipulate the law. It was the sanctuary where the Thorne family had kept their most private records for 3 generations. Thorne's childhood home. How? Thorne breathed. The word was a broken sob. The family estate was in a protected trust. It was unreachable. The trust was based on the same 1924 charter you used to try and seize the Blackwood district, Elara said. Her voice was cold, surgical. You forgot that the trust required the primary beneficiary to maintain a clean environmental record. The moment the state issued the final notice of the chemical burial pits, the trust dissolved. She paused, letting the silence fill the room. The property went to an immediate public liquidation to cover the fines. My shell company was the only bidder. I bought it an hour ago, for $1 over the lien. Thorne collapsed back into his chair. He looked at the deed. He looked at Elara's name at the bottom of the page. The woman he had treated like a servant was now the owner of his memories. She was the landlord of his history. My things, Thorne stammered. My father's papers. The portraits. Everything inside that house now belongs to the Vance estate, Elara said. She reached up and touched the gilded serpent brooch. Her finger traced the gold coils. Every record. Every secret ledger. Every piece of evidence of the crimes your family committed to build this city. It is all mine now. She leaned in closer. Her scent was a blend of sandalwood and cold rain. It was the scent of a storm that had finally arrived. My grandfather was the gardener for that estate. Sterling, your father fired him because he saw your father dumping chemicals into the stream. He tried to tell the authorities, but your father used his strategic power to make sure no one would listen. He made my grandfather a ghost in his own city. Elara's eyes flashed with a sudden, piercing intensity. But the land has a memory, and I am the archive. Thorne looked at her. He saw the razor-sharp cheekbones. He saw the almond eyes. He saw the gold wire in her hair. He realized that he wasn't looking at a servant. He was looking at the ghost of everyone he had ever stepped on. He was looking at the physical manifestation of the justice he thought he could avoid. The gilded serpent brooch seemed to expand in his vision. The emerald eyes were no longer just gems. They were a judgment. Checkmate. Sterling.Elara picked up the deed. She tucked it back into her jacket. She turned and walked toward the door. "Wait," Thorne cried out. His voice was a high, thin wail. "What are you going to do with the house?" Elara stopped at the threshold. She didn't look back. "I am going to tear it down, Sterling. Every brick, every pillar, every toxic secret. I am going to return the land to the salt marsh. I am going to let the water wash the Thorne name away forever." She stepped out of the office, the door closed with a soft, final thud. Thorne was alone in the dark. The grandfather clock struck the hour. But the sound was different now. It wasn't the sound of time. It was the sound of a legacy being erased. Outside in the hallway, Elara Vance walked toward the elevators. Her pulse was steady. Her hands were cold. She felt the heavy weight of the deed against her heart. She felt the satisfaction of a debt finally paid in full. She touched the gold wire in her hair. She thought about her grandfather. She thought about the garden she was going to build on the ruins of the Thorne estate. The matriarch's will had been executed. The checkmate meeting was over. But the fall of the gentry had only just begun. The silence that followed Elara Vance's departure was not empty. It was a suffocating, heavy presence that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. Sterling Thorne sat motionless behind his desk. The glow of the city lights outside cast long, jagged shadows across the mahogany. He felt a phantom chill creeping up his spine. It was the coldness of a man who had finally realized he was standing on a trapdoor. He looked down at his hands. They were the hands of a senator, a kingmaker, a man who had moved billions with a whisper. Now they were shaking. The skin looked thin, like parchment stretched over bone. He reached for the bottom drawer of his desk. He pulled out a heavy, steel-bound ledger. It was the Thorne family archive, a book that had been passed from father to son for 3 generations. It contained the original deeds, the private agreements, the secret history of the Thorne ascent. He turned the pages with a frantic, desperate energy. He was looking for a shield. He was looking for a clause that Elara Vance had missed. He believed in the permanence of stone and steel. He believed that the Thorne name was etched into the very crust of the earth. Then he found it. The master agreement for the land beneath the Thorne building, dated January 8th, 1927. His eyes scanned the faded ink. His heart began to hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. The document was not a deed of ownership. It was a 99-year ground lease. In the world of the old gentry, 99 years feels like eternity. It is a time frame designed to make a family feel like gods. But in the world of strategic power, 99 years is just a countdown. Sterling Thorne looked at the date. January 8th, 2026. Midnight. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was 12:05. The lease had expired 5 minutes ago in her private sanctuary. Elara Vance sat in a high-backed chair of black velvet. She was the picture of unmovable authority. Her deep bronze skin was bathed in the soft, amber glow of the fireplace. She reached up and touched the gold wire wrapped around her silk-pressed ponytail. It felt cold, precise. She looked at the gilded serpent brooch on her lapel. The 24,000 gold seemed to pulse with the light of the flames. The emerald eyes were bright, piercing. They were the eyes of a woman who had waited a lifetime for this specific midnight. Elara was not thinking about the money. She was thinking about the concept of time as a weapon. At the IMF, she had seen how the most powerful nations were often held hostage by the fine print of history. She knew that the Thorne family had built their entire empire on a lease-to-own agreement. It was a classic institutional strategy. The city had granted the Thorne patriarch a long-term lease on the condition of ethical stewardship. It was a legal vestige of a more romantic era. If the Thorne family remained in good standing, the lease would convert to a full ownership deed at the end of the term. But there was a kill switch. The agreement stipulated that if the lessee was found to be in material breach of public trust or environmental negligence, the option to buy would be void. The property would not revert to the city. It would revert to the holder of the ground lease renewal rights, and Elara Vance had bought those rights 5 years ago. She had found the dormant holding company that owned the underlying dirt. She had bought it for a fraction of its value, because no one believed the Thorne family would ever lose their grip. No one believed the Kingmaker would ever commit a breach so massive that it would trigger a reversion. Elara had made sure he did. The environmental audit, the Maritime Loophole, the fiduciary negligence. These were not just attacks. They were triggers. They were the legal conditions required to disqualify Sterling Thorne from renewing his lease. She leaned back. The scent of sandalwood and old books filled the air. She felt the heavy weight of the serpent brooch. It was a grounding force. She felt the pulse in her throat. Steady, rhythmic dots. She imagined Sterling Thorne in his office, realizing that he was no longer a landlord. He was a TRESPASSER. Every floor of the Thorne building, every marble pillar, every gold-plated fixture. It all belonged to the land, and the land belonged to her. This was the fall of the gentry. It wasn't a loud explosion. It was the silent expiration of a contract. It was the realization that your entire legacy was built on borrowed time. Sterling Thorne dropped the ledger. The heavy book hit the floor with a thud that echoed through the empty office. He felt a sudden, sharp coldness in his limbs. He looked at the walls. He looked at the ceiling. He felt like he was standing inside a rib cage. He picked up his phone. He tried to dial his head of security. The line was dead. He tried to dial the building manager. No answer. The system he had built was already identifying him as an intruder. The biometric scanners at the door, the digital locks on the vault, the encrypted servers, they were all linked to the master lease. When the lease expired, the access codes changed. Thorne walked to the door of his office. He pulled the handle. It didn't move. He tried his key card. The light flashed red dot. He was locked in. He turned and looked at the window. He saw the reflection of a man who had lost everything. He saw the reflection of a man who had been outplayed by the very woman he had ignored. He realized then that Elara Vance had not just taken his money. She had taken his sovereignty. She had used the rules of the elite to strip him of his status. She had used the law to turn him into a ghost. Elara Vance stood up. She walked to the window of her penthouse. The rain had stopped. The city was a grid of black and gold. She looked toward the Thorne building. The lights on the top floor were flickering. She reached up and adjusted the serpent brooch. The emerald eyes reflected the city lights. The fall was complete. Tomorrow morning, the world would wake up to a new reality. The Thorne name would be stripped from the building. The family crest would be chiseled off the marble. The institutional justice she had sought was finally a matter of record. She felt a deep, soul-level satisfaction. It was the feeling of a circle closing. It was the feeling of her grandfather's name being restored to the land. She thought about the internal monologue of the Thorne men. They always believed they were the architects. They believed the people were just the bricks. They never understood that the bricks eventually learned how to move. Elara turned away from the window. She walked toward her bedroom. Her silk-pressed ponytail swayed with a slow, deliberate motion. The gold wire shimmered. She didn't need to check her phone. She didn't need to call her lawyers. She knew the machine she had built was working perfectly. The Lease-to-Own agreement was a masterpiece of corporate trap setting, and Sterling Thorne had walked right into it with a smirk on his face. He had built a monument to his arrogance, and she had turned it into his prison. The gentry had fallen, not because of a revolution in the streets, but because of a renewal in the archives. The Matriarch's will was the new law of the land. Elara dimmed the lights. The room went dark. Only the faint, Green glow of the serpent's eyes remained for a second before vanishing. Sterling Thorne sat in the dark, listening to the sound of the city, waiting for the morning marshals to arrive, waiting for the final erasure. He had lived his life believing he was the predator. He died a political death, realizing he was the prey. The fall of the gentry was absolute. The morning air was a razor. It smelled of heavy frost, wet concrete, and the bitter temps of oxidized iron. The sun was a pale, white disk hanging over the horizon of the capital city. It provided no warmth. It only served to illuminate the wreckage of a dream. Elara Vance stood at the edge of the Blackwood district. She was a silhouette of absolute, unshakable precision against the gray sky. Her deep bronze skin looked radiant, a flawless finish that seemed to repel the cold. Her high cheekbones were sharp enough to cut the wind. Her almond-shaped eyes did not blink as she surveyed the hollowed-out remains of Sterling Thorne's ambition. She was dressed in a floor-length coat of midnight wool. It was the color of a moonless sky. Beneath it, on her left lapel, the Gilded Serpent Brooch caught the early light. The 24,000 gold body of the snake seemed to writhe as she breathed. The emerald eyes were 2 drops of frozen green fire. They were looking at the ruins. Her waist-length silk-pressed ponytail was a vertical line of jet black. It was anchored at the base by the gold wire that had become her signature. It was a crown of strategic power, a symbol of a woman who had mastered the art of the long weight dot in her gloved hands. She held a roll of ancient vellum. It was the original 1924 map of the valley. It was the map that Sterling Thorne had spent 40 years trying to erase. She unrolled it. The paper crackled. It was the sound of history being reopened. The map showed the original tide lines, the public wharves, the marshlands. It showed the truth that the Thorne family had buried under layers of stolen concrete. Behind her, 3 massive yellow cranes stood like executioners. Their long, steel arms were positioned over the half-built towers of the Thorne building. Hanging from the center crane was a wrecking ball of solid iron. It was a 4-ton pendulum of institutional justice. The crane operator was watching her. He was waiting for the signal. Elara looked at the towers. They were skeletons of steel. They were 30 stories of hubris. Sterling Thorne had built them to be his legacy. He had built them to prove that a man with enough political power can rewrite the laws of the earth. He was wrong. The earth has a memory, and the law has a guardian. Elara thought about her grandfather. She thought about the day he was chased off this land. She thought about the years he spent in the archives, recording the secrets, saving the maps. He had died believing that the truth would eventually find its way to the surface. She was the fulfillment of that belief. She was the final will. She reached up and touched the serpent brooch. The gold felt cold through her glove. She felt the heavy weight of the emerald eyes. They were not just gems. They were the witnesses to her victory. Sterling Thorne was not here. He was sitting in a federal holding cell. His assets had been seized. His bank accounts were empty. His name had been scrubbed from the legislative record. He was no longer a senator. He was no longer a kingmaker. He was merely a footnote in a case of fiduciary negligence and environmental crime. The checkmate had been absolute. Elara looked at the map one last time. She saw the signature of the original surveyor, a man who had been paid to lie. She saw the ink where her grandfather had corrected the lines in secret. 50 years later, strategic power is not about the buildings you raise. It is about the foundations you control. Thorne had built on a lie. Elara had dismantled him with the truth. She raised her right hand. The crane operator engaged the gears. The sound was a low, grinding roar that shook the earth. The wrecking ball began to swing. It was a slow, majestic movement. It carried the kinetic energy of a century of repressed justice. Elara watched as the iron ball struck the corner of the 30th floor. The sound was deafening. It was the sound of a billion-dollar mistake being corrected. Steel buckled. Concrete shattered into a cloud of white dust. The glass of the high-altitude windows exploded like 1,000 diamonds falling in the sun. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She watched as the ball swung back, and then forward again. Each blow was a sentence. Each strike was a clause in the liquidation of the Thorne name. The first tower began to groan. It was a deep, metallic sound, the sound of a dying institution. It leaned slowly toward the center of the site. And then it collapsed into its own foundation. A massive cloud of dust rose into the air. It covered the street. It covered the cranes. But Elara Vance stood above it. Her charcoal coat was untouched. Her gold wire was shining dot. She felt the vibration in the soles of her boots. It was a grounding, satisfying tremor. The destruction of the Thorne building was not a crime. It was a restoration. Under the Admiralty Decree of Public Restoration, the land was being returned to its sovereign state. By sunset, the steel would be hauled away as scrap. By next month, the salt marsh would be reopened to the river. The people of Blackwood would have their park. The water would have its path, and the Matriarch would have her peace. Elara rolled up the 1924 map. She tucked it under her arm. She turned away from the demolition. She didn't need to see the rest. She knew the physics of gravity. She knew the inevitability of the law. She walked toward her waiting car, a silent electric vehicle that was as black as the night. Her driver opened the door. He was a young man with a respectful, disciplined face. "Where to now, Miss Vance?" Elara sat in the back. She leaned her head against the silk headrest. She reached up and adjusted the Gilded Serpent Brooch. The emerald eyes seemed to glow with a new, quiet light. "Home," she said. Her voice was a low, velvety tone that carried the resonance of a job completed. "And then send a message to the Board of Trustees." She paused. She looked out the window at the falling towers. "Tell them the land is clean. The debt is settled, and the will has been executed in full." The car moved away from the site. It was a ghost in the morning fog dot behind her. The wrecking balls continued their work. The sound of the Thorne legacy being chiseled into dust echoed through the city. Sterling Thorne had spent his life believing he was the architect of his own destiny. He had forgotten that every architect works for the owner of the land. And Elara Vance owned the land. Institutional justice is a slow machine. But when it arrives, it is absolute. It does not accept bribes. It does not recognize status. It only recognizes the ledger. The ledger was now closed. Elara Vance closed her eyes. She felt the silk of her ponytail against her neck. She felt the cold gold of the serpent. She felt the silent power of a woman who had rewritten the history of a city without ever raising her voice. The final will was not a document. It was a result that Gentry had fallen. The archives were secure. The water was flowing back to the valley. The story of Sterling Thorne was over. The era of the Matriarch had begun.